Hello, and welcome to Ken Wilber's infamous loft. I wanted to be really clear what our intention is today. We're setting up a live dialogue. I will be speaking, giving a Dharma talk in the Universal Hall at Findhorn, and Ken he'll be zooming in electronically, and we will have a dialogue that will be live on October 6th. But I wanted to really give him an opportunity to present a conceptual framework that will really set up the dialogue that we'll be having on October 6th. So our intention is to, through several very carefully scripted questions, allow Ken to set up the conceptual framework that is important, so important, for the dialogue that we'll be having on the 6th. Now, there's something I would really think that it's imperative that you know about Ken that is not self-evident from watching him or reading his books, and that is his incredible heart. I remember the first time I met Ken. I expected a brilliant intellect. I mean, goodness, how many books has he written? But that's not what met me at the door. And this is what doesn't come across in the books, and often doesn't come across even in the videos when Ken is talking. The incredible heart that he has, that just, in Buddhism, we call this bodhicitta. We call it deep, selfless caring that arises in a clear, absolutely clear mind. And that's the heart that met me at the door. And that's the heart that I just breaks my heart that he's giving out of the generosity of his heart, this deep, selfless caring, his time to share with us his insight and his understanding of the problems that we're facing today in these very interesting times. So thank you very much for joining us. I'd like to lead with just a few moments of meditation. So get a comfortable position. And we want to begin with beginner's mind. So empty your mind of all thoughts. Really find this place of stillness beyond thinking. This place of stillness beyond feeling. Let your heart be completely at peace. And let your body fully relax. Even those places where you hide the trauma. Just relax and drop all the way into the silence. And in this silence, remove all expectations, all likes and dislikes, all thoughts, and just listen. Listen as generously, as completely as you can. Deep gratitude. Thank you. So the first question that we're interested in is the many transformational communities that will be listening to this dialogue. What we want to really start and do is appreciate the many contributions that they've made for the world. So Ken, what are some of the contributions that these transformational communities that are listening today have brought into the world?
Well, thank you, Doshin. Wonderful to be here with you. And I appreciate these questions very much. This is a very important topic. Maybe I could start with a little bit of background by saying that the great wisdom traditions generally distinguish between what they call the two truths doctrine. Namely, men and women have two major types of truth available to them. They have a relative truth, and they have an ultimate truth. Relative truth involves things like the truths of science. So if I say water is made of 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom, that's a relative truth. And it is true. It's correct. In this relative, manifest, finite world, water is indeed made of hydrogen and oxygen. But there's also ultimate truth, or spiritual truth, or infinite truth, or timeless and eternal truth. And in ultimate truth, water is not made of hydrogen and oxygen. Water is made of spirit, or Godhead, or Goddess, or Brahman, or Tao, or Buddha nature, or Ein Sof, and so on. Now, both of those are true, and both of those truths are desperately needed. Throughout history, there have been cultures that have tried to get by on just one of those truths, and the results have not been very good. And starting with the Western Enlightenment, the modern West made 2 very major moves. One, it tended to reject ultimate truth altogether. And yet 2, it made some stunning advances in relative truth. In ultimate truth, the West simply rejected the notion that there was anything like an infinite ground of all being, a god or goddess that was our own truest reality and our own deepest self. Any sort of infinite ultimate reality was denied. And there was only the manifest, finite, conventional, everyday, secular world. And the claim that, quote, God is dead rang out across Europe, and humankind was left entirely on its own to face existence. This new world has been called everything from the disenchanted universe to the disqualified universe to one-dimensional humans. Now, there were versions of ultimate truth that definitely deserved to be let go of. Some of the early versions of God were what has been called mythic literal, which means that they were myths that were taken to be literally and empirically true. So Moses really did part the Red Sea. Lot's wife really was turned into a pillar of salt. God really did rain locusts down on the Egyptians, and so on. There's nothing deep or metaphorical or transcendental about any of those myths. They're just childish forms of cognition, and Jehovah in many ways was no different than, say, Zeus or Apollo or Santa Claus or the Tooth Fairy. Those are all myths, but they're hardly good examples of ultimate truth. Tooth Fairy, ultimate truth. So the modern West was right to reject all those childish versions of myth. But it got so excited in this effort that it really did throw the baby out with the bathwater. Not just childish mythic versions of ultimate truth, but all versions of ultimate truth, including the waking up versions of enlightenment, metamorphosis, moksha, satori. All of those were summarily tossed out the window, and the disenchanted universe was upon us. But in the realm of relative truth, there was a genuine explosion of important discoveries. Start with the fact that virtually all of the modern sciences just burst onto the scene almost at once. Modern physics, modern chemistry, modern biology, modern geology, and so on. This would eventually do everything from plopping a person on the moon to increasing the average lifespan of all people on the planet by a stunning 3 decades. It was truly extraordinary. But even within a relative truth, the view of the world that emerged here was not truly complete or inclusive or comprehensive. Its view of the world has been called scientific materialism. And it was just that. It saw the world as consisting of nothing but matter, and then only matter that could be seen objectively with the 5 senses or their extensions, like microscopes or telescopes and so on. So of that legendary trinity of the good, the true, and the beautiful, scientific materialism was only interested in objective material truth. And it completely tossed out the good and the beautiful entirely. In fact, any sort of interior realities were denied real existence. Values, goals, aesthetics, spirituality, virtues, love, care, compassion, none of those were considered real anymore. So with all of the good that the modern sciences brought, they also brought a devastating reduction in the richness of human potentials. Truly, just devastating. From that point on, the modern West limped forward with no God, no values, no interiors, no morals, no good, no beautiful, a world with no ultimate truth at all, and an anemic, disenchanted relative truth. So, cut to the 60s, cut to Findhorn, cut to the human potentials movement, to the rise of transformational communities around the world. This whole period has been called that of postmodernism, of multiculturalism, diversity, inclusion, sensitivity. The previous major epoch was called modernity or modernism, and this recent epoch, coming right after that one, was after modernity or post-modernity or postmodernism. And the postmodern communities of transformation, including Findhorn, did 2 profoundly important things. In relative truth, they introduced an enchanted world instead of the disenchanted wasteland. And in ultimate truth, they simply brought back ultimate truth itself. They realized that it definitely does exist and that it is central to any sort of a life well lived. In short, they brought a spirit of enchantment. And this changed everything, absolutely everything.
So thank you, Ken. Now, when it came to re-enchanting the world, can you give us a specific example of what that looked like?
As we had just briefly mentioned, there really were an enormous number of approaches that these communities introduced, and they covered a great number of different areas. But there was a central issue, probably the major issue, and it concerned this whole notion of hierarchy. Now, this might just sound sort of academic and abstruse, but stay with me and I think you'll see how utterly central hierarchy was to this whole issue. A hierarchy, of course, is a system of ranking where certain values or traits are taken to be higher than others, and those others are taken to be lower or inferior or more primitive or less valuable. Postmodernism came to see ranking or hierarchy as central to virtually all of the modern world's social ills, oppression, and suffering. History itself was seen as a playing out of various nasty and oppressive hierarchies that arbitrarily judged others to be inferior or primitive or less valuable. The entire list of things that postmodernism took to be very, very bad is a list of dominator hierarchies. These included slavery, where certain groups were simply treated like property and bought and sold. They were on the bottom rungs of the hierarchy. Or patriarchy, where women were treated as if they were slaves, the property of this or that male. They were also on the bottom levels of that hierarchy. And entire social systems were homophobic or prejudiced towards homosexuals, or they were xenophobic, hating other cultures other than their own, or imperialistic, invading and conquering other cultures, or colonialistic, militarily treating other cultures as mere extensions of their own. And even in everyday activities like business organizations, there is generally just one person, almost always a male, sitting on top of an organizational hierarchy and giving orders to everybody else. For postmodernism, the vast majority of human beings were sitting on the bottom of one or more of these oppressive and dominating hierarchies. And for those humans, the world indeed was disenchanted, pale and anemic in its opportunities and its rewards. Even the typical normal person had an entire set of inner hierarchies that were always criticizing and controlling them. You can never do anything right. You're worthless. You should do this and you shouldn't do that. What an idiot you are. And this definitely disenchanted their interiors. So a major way that postmodernism worked to re-enchant people's lives was to, quote, flatten the hierarchies, get rid of these vicious ranking systems that judge people to be superior or inferior, worthwhile or worth less, good or bad, and start treating everybody as being truly and deeply equal, and help people get rid of their own interior judgments and criticisms and negativity, and help them find a deep and abiding center of absolute peace. Likewise, in community organizations, from everyday businesses to places like Findhorn, definitely flatten the hierarchies, move to create work environments that acknowledge and respect the true equality of all beings in non-judgmental, non-ranking ways. That re-enchanting of the world in relative truth was especially helped by the introduction of a spiritual realm in ultimate truth. This ultimate truth was not a childish, mythic, literal story, but an actual practice of waking up. That is, all human beings, all sentient beings actually, were seen as perfect expressions or manifestations of an ultimate spirit. And this ultimate reality was the truest and deepest self of everybody. The whole aim of a contemplative path of realization was to transform consciousness from a relative, separate, contracted, and suffering ego to an awakening of one's own deepest reality, which was not other than infinite spirit itself, radiant, timeless, infinite, and all-inclusive. This realization of one's truest and ultimate self was called, as we earlier mentioned, enlightenment, awakening, metamorphosis, moksha, vana, satori. Sufis called it the supreme identity because it was a discovery of the fact that one's own deepest self was actually one with infinite spirit. This supreme identity is the discovery that ultimate truth lies in the deepest core of your own being. And this discovery absolutely helped with the re-enchanting of the world. Thus, overall, the discovery of the, quote, spirit of an enchanted world is what the postmodern communities of transformation brought to the world. And it truly marked one of the major transformations in all of humanity's evolution.
As I travel the world teaching in these communities that have been re-enchanting the world, I've noticed that many of the same problems are being struggled with. So from your perspective, are these communities struggling today with some common problems? And if so, what might they be?
Well, if you look at this whole area of enchanting the world or re-enchanting the world by flattening all hierarchies or deconstructing all hierarchies, it wasn't clear at the start exactly how this should be done and if there were ways that could actually be harmful. This getting rid of all hierarchies and actually treating absolutely all people equally was, in fact, a relatively new experiment in humankind's history. But these postmodern communities, as well as the entire academic force of postmodern philosophy, began exactly to try and act as if no judgmental rankings should be made at all, anywhere. No value was better than another value. All were perfectly equal. This is called egalitarian. So what's true for you is true for you. What's true for me is true for me. And that's it. So in postmodern philosophy, there actually was a massive attempt to redo philosophy entirely without using any sort of value judgment at all. In other words, no hierarchies. Even judgments like science is real and novels are fictional, even that distinction was denied. There simply is no difference, no hierarchy, between what ordinary people call truth and fiction. It was aggressively maintained that science was no more true or real than poetry or fantasy. Seriously. This got taken to such extremes that we are now in what has been called a post-truth or post-factual world. Every single view you want is taken to be equally true, and that gets rid of those nasty hierarchies between right and wrong, good and bad, true and false. So wherever you see a hierarchy, you simply deconstruct it. All those nasty rankings are finally gotten rid of, and totally. Now, the same thing was happening in ordinary, everyday reality. We're not supposed to make any negative judgments about anybody or any belief or any culture. This is called multiculturalism, the idea that all cultures are absolutely equal in value. Everybody is radically and totally equal. If everybody is completely equal, does that mean, for example, that we are to totally and equally accept the Nazis? What about the KKK? Treat them with equality and complete acceptance as well? Somehow something seems to be a little bit off about the idea of getting rid of all ranking, getting rid of all hierarchies, all judgments. In some way, certain hierarchies or rankings actually seem useful and important. In some ways, things like the Nazis and the KKK, the white supremacists, are indeed not good, or they represent lesser values in some sense. So some hierarchies are indeed bad, but it's starting to look like some seem to be very good and very important. And simply trying to get rid of all hierarchies was a bad idea. And worse, the desire to get rid of all hierarchies appeared to be deeply self-contradictory as well. For example, we saw that the postmodern philosophers were, virtually all of them, claiming that truth was irrelevant, that there really wasn't any truth. Truth was just a fad, like a hem length in fashion. It doesn't have any real meaning. But what this was actually saying is that it is the truth that there is no truth. If the postmodernists are correct that there is no truth, then what the postmodernists themselves are saying has no truth, and thus there's no reason whatsoever that I should take what they're saying seriously. If what they're saying is correct, then their entire viewpoint itself is just another worthless hem length. Everywhere, the extreme denial of all hierarchies, all rankings, all judgments, was starting to backfire badly. Getting rid of some hierarchies, or at least softening some, definitely seemed to be a good idea. But simply getting rid of all hierarchies, all rankings, was turning out to be disastrous. And so the question started to arise in all sorts of areas. If not all hierarchies are totally bad, then which of them are bad and which of them are actually good? And most importantly, how can you tell the difference? That became the crucial question.
So Ken, from your perspective, how did that problem show up in the transformational communities?
Well, notice that another word for the attitude that postmodernism brought to the scene is egalitarian. And that means completely equal. So that's another word for treating everybody absolutely equal, for not making any judgments or rankings about people, for getting rid of all hierarchies and all rankings, for not saying that this thing is better than that thing. And this egalitarian attitude was something that deeply pervaded the transformational communities. If you were in one of these communities and you made a really negative statement about some race or some sex or some nationality, or really any group at all, that was a major no-no. So treating everybody equally and not making any negative judgments or rankings or hierarchies was something that was practiced by virtually all of these communities. It was an actual exercise. Develop non-judgmental awareness. Human beings do indeed have both of these major transformations available to them. They can both wake up and they can grow up. These are not the same at all, these two transformations. Waking up refers to the process of discovering ultimate truth. We saw that transformation has been called enlightenment, awakening, metamorphosis, moksha, fana, satori, and so on. It represents a human being transforming from a limited identity with their separate, isolated, fragmented, conventional self, often called the ego, to a discovery of their supreme identity, which is an identity of their deepest self with infinite spirit itself. Godhead, goddess, Brahman, Tao, the great perfection, emptiness. And growing up, on the other hand, refers to the process that the relative self goes through as it matures and develops. So waking up is transformation to ultimate truth. Growing up is transformation in relative truth. Evidence gathered in over 40 different cultures has demonstrated that all human beings go through those major stages or levels of development. Should the great transformational communities take up as one of their major goals the transmission of systems of practice that fully teach their members how to both wake up and grow up, this would catapult these communities back into the very forefront of leading edge evolution that they enjoyed 50 or 60 years ago, but have lately, I'm sorry to say, fairly well lost. The super leading edge today is to experience waking up and interpret it not from the postmodern stage, but from the leading edge integral stage, Claire Gray's cataclysmic and monumental leap of meaning, taking these communities out of being stuck, as they are now, in what has actually become a bit of an old, musty, yesterday consciousness, that of postmodernism enchantment, and jolt them to the very highest leading edge of an advanced waking up interpreted by the highest integral stage of growing up evolution. Placing these communities once again at the very front of evolution itself, pointing the way to humankind to likewise follow their own highest possibilities and truest potentials. The thrill would be back. The idealism would resurrect. The ecstatic joy of helping humanity would return tenfold, drenching the heart with radiant love, laminating the mind with glorious wholeness, pushing forward humanity's gorgeously deepest dreams. Just like in the old days, but there's nothing old about this. It would include a radical openness and invitations to younger generations across the board, Gen X, Millennials, and iGen, all welcome to be set afire by the most glorious vision and thunderous goal ever to cross humanity's path.